Coming up on Arirang News, President Moon Jae-in pledges the government's utmost efforts to protect jobs amid this economic crisis, telling officials to find ways to support companies that keep people employed. South Korea's exports in the first 10 days of this month were down almost 19% from a year ago because of the coronavirus pandemic. Petroleum products in particular were down by almost half. And South Korea is now testing everyone arriving in the country from the United States. Infected people coming from the U.S. have recently accounted for half of all the country's imported cases. It's 5 o'clock p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. From today, all arrivals to South Korea from the United States will have to be tested for COVID-19 within 3 days of going into their required self-isolation. The new measures come as around half of South Korea's imported cases are people arriving from the U.S. Kan Hyung-woo reports.
South Korea is ramping up its COVID-19 preventive measures to reduce the number of imported cases from the United States. Starting Monday, all arrivals from the U.S. must get tested within 3 days of self-isolation.
Previously, only those showing symptoms were tested, but we plan to test every arrival from the U.S. within 3 days of self-isolation.
The new measures come as there has been a steady rise in the number of imported COVID-19 cases from the U.S.
50% of imported patients, 228 out of the 459, were from the U.S. over the past 2 weeks, and it's posing a higher risk. So we are shifting to a test everyone policy like we have on European arrivals.
The South Korean government's suspension of visa-free entry and visa waiver programs for 90 countries that have imposed entry bans on South Koreans also takes effect Monday. The country has seen fewer domestic cases in the past week, with the number of new cases staying around 30 for the second straight day on Sunday. Since March 27th, health authorities have required all entrants from the U.S. to follow a 2-week self-quarantine, regardless of whether they display symptoms or not. Kan Hyung-woo, Arirang News.
South Koreans under self-quarantine will be allowed to vote in Wednesday's general election, as long as they're not showing coronavirus symptoms. According to the Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasures Headquarters, those whose self-isolation started on April 1st to the 14th, and those who don't have symptoms on Election Day, can vote after 6 p.m. Korea time. That'll be after non-quarantine people have finished voting. More specifically, voters under self-quarantine will be allowed to leave their homes or facilities after 5:20 p.m., arrive at the polling stations before 6, and then they have to return to their homes or facilities by 7. However, they are not allowed to use public transportation and will have to travel on foot or by car wearing face masks. They'll either be monitored by the government's mobile app for self-isolators or be accompanied by health officials. There's been an encouraging decline in the number of new cases in South Korea in recent days. Social distancing is still in place, but if things continue to improve, then the government plans to issue a set of new guidelines. Our Kim Do-yeon has a preview.
With the number of new coronavirus cases remaining below 50 cases a day in South Korea, the government is considering modifying its COVID-19 prevention guidelines. Here are the 5 key rules the government are labeling routine safety measures. Staying home when sick. In the case of high fever or persistent coughing, people are recommended to call in sick and stay inside. The guidelines say employers should support sick employees by allowing them to stay home without any fear of them losing their job or other repercussions. Keeping a safe distance between people. The distance should be at least a meter, and people should continue to refrain from hugs and handshakes. Disinfecting household items and letting fresh air into your home. Airing out your house once in the morning and again at night is recommended. People are still encouraged to avoid gatherings in enclosed spaces. Disinfecting objects with diluted bleach every week is also encouraged. Practicing good personal hygiene and covering coughs. You are urged to wash your hands thoroughly every 2 hours, and it's recommended you refrain from touching your face. Also, to cover coughs, use your sleeves instead of your hands. Staying in touch with others. While we can't communicate face-to-face as much, the government asks people to stay connected by video call, phone, text, or email. Also, the guidelines say COVID-19 patients or people in self-quarantine should not be shunned or discriminated against. The rules, which are being finalized as the government gathers more opinions online, should be out later this month to level down from the current measures while still maintaining sensible measures to protect people from COVID-19. Kim Do-young, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in says the government will focus all policy efforts on protecting jobs, saying that's the core of economic revitalization. In a meeting with his top aides on Monday, President Moon noted the rise in the number of jobless people, calling for special measures to support companies and maintain employment. Take a listen.
일자리가 무너지면 국민의 삶이 무너지고 그로부터 초래되는 사회적 비용은 이루 말할 수 없습니다. 고용 유지에 쓰는 돈은 헛돈이 아닙니다. 일자리를 잃을 경우 지출해야 할 복지 비용을 감안하면 오히려 비용을 줄이고 미래를 대비하는 생산적 투자입니다.
The president said the issue of jobs will be the agenda of next week's meeting of the Emergency Economic Council. The key, Moon said, is to enable companies to keep people employed, calling on officials to seek strong and aggressive support for companies that do so. He stressed that the country cannot afford to repeat the mass unemployment it saw during the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The president also called for measures to protect freelancers and the self-employed, who are not covered by employment insurance. President Moon also thanked the Korean people for practicing social distancing, saying that quarantine is the start of getting the economy back on track. But he said now is not the time to lower their guard and called for continued efforts, expressing hope that stabilizing the situation will speed up the economic revitalization. Because of the pandemic, South Korean exports in the first 10 days of this month were down almost 19% compared to the same period last year. According to the Korea Customs Service, shipments in the first 10 days of April fell 18.6% on year to $12.2 billion US. Exports of petroleum products were down nearly 48%. Automobile parts were down more than 30%. In March, however, South Korea's ICT exports were up on year for a second straight month. ICT exports came to $16 billion, an increase of 1.1%. Automakers Hyundai Motor and Kia Motors are considering a one-week shutdown of several of their domestic factories because of a lack of demand overseas. Hyundai announced that a plant in the east coast city of Ulsan will be closed from today until Friday. Kia is looking at a shutdown of 3 factories in Gwangmyeong and Gwangju from April 23rd to the 29th. These 3 plants make up most of the country's vehicles for exports, such as the Sportage and Soul models. The 2 car makers have already suspended production at most of their overseas plants, including ones in China and the U.S. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Monday. And for that, I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-sak, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for making time today.
Happy to be here.
Well, OPEC and its allies have finally agreed to cut oil production by almost 10 million barrels a day with some special provisions made for Mexico, which at first was not on board. Is this going to be enough to get prices back up?
Probably not. The market doesn't seem to think so. The oil price futures did go up by about 5%, but it's still very low compared to where it was before the coronavirus. And fundamentally, the problem is that demand is very low. The economy of the largest oil consumer, China, is very sluggish. The largest oil-consuming industry, which are the airlines, are paralyzed. And the demand is not likely to pick up until COVID-19 is under control. And because the OPEC and the other oil producers are still pumping, we actually have, in some countries, shortage of places to put the oil. So it's not going to work itself out for a while. But the bigger problem may be that it's not entirely clear whether United States firms will join in the supply cut, because some U.S. firms want to drive down prices to choke shale oil producers within their own country, drive them out of business, or buy them out cheaply. And even though President Trump is brokering this supply cut, the coordinated price cuts, the collusion may be illegal under U.S. antitrust laws. And it's also ironic because President Trump actually during his presidential campaign argued that the oil prices should go lower. But anyhow, because fundamentally the price fixing and collusion is not good for consumers, so there's also a pushback from that side. But until the demand picks up, oil prices will not pick up as well.
Well, Wall Street markets, stock markets were closed for Good Friday. European markets closed for Easter Monday. Futures, though, pointing to a strong open possibly on Monday for the FTSE and some others. What's the story in the global markets?
Okay, well, Asian markets actually fell a bit today, depending on the country, in the 0% range to about 2% range. But for the last 2 weeks or so, the markets have been relatively calm. There has been slow and steady growth. The United States market during the last week rose from 10 to 13%. China rose 1.18%, and even Japanese stock market rose. And that's, I think, mostly because the central bank and the governments have done everything they can to absorb much of the risk that's coming out from the coronavirus. All the lesser demand, the supply shocks, they've all added a lot of risk to the various companies which have been responsible for the large drops in stock prices. But because the government is now providing funds, providing liquidity, and absorbing all the risks from the coronavirus as much as the governments can, things are, I think, back to nervously normal. They know that if they get into big trouble, the government will do everything it can to help them out. So that is reducing a lot of risk, and that is returning the stock market to somewhat normality. But if there's further shocks, if the COVID virus gets suddenly worse, we'll see a lot of volatility again.
Well, Professor Young, numbers-wise, what are we going to see coming out in the week ahead?
Okay, well, the most important number is for Korea, March unemployment report. The February unemployment report, as well as the inflation reports for February and March, haven't really it seems like Korea hasn't really been hit by the coronavirus all that much compared to historical unemployment rates that we've seen in the United States and Europe. So that's somewhat lucky for Korea, but still, we're sort of expecting bad news. We'll have to see how big a bad news is. It might be that Korea will go, it'll still mean a lot of hardship, but Korea will go out relatively well. And then on Friday, the Ministry of Economy and Finance will release their Green Book report, how the economy is doing so far in April. That's probably going to give us what the closest to a real-time report on how the economy is doing. And then foreign-wise, Tuesday we have China's trade account figures to see whether China is beginning to recover. And on Wednesday and Thursday, we'll have U.S. retail sales and weekly U.S. unemployment filing. We'll have to see whether United States economy is leveling off or it's getting worse.
All right, Professor Young, we'll have to ask you about those numbers when they are out. Thank you, as always, for coming on.
Thank you.
Now, there are signs in the U.S. that the COVID-19 outbreak could be nearing a peak. So now a number of health officials are raising the possibility of reopening the American economy next month. But when asked whether President Trump's May 1st target can be met, they urged caution about reopening too quickly. Kim Yo-sun reports.
Senior U.S. public health officials say the country could start to gradually reopen in May amid signs the COVID-19 pandemic has reached its peak. Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, told CNN Sunday that parts of the country could begin easing restrictions next month, but he urged caution. He added that different states will be ready at different times rather than the U.S. turning on a, quote, light switch. However, the head of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration said Sunday that is hopeful about Trump administration's target of May 1st as a date for reopening the country.
We're looking at May 1st. Obviously, we want that to happen as soon as possible. I can't predict at this point because, as I said, things are happening very rapidly. But this team of doctors, this team of experts, all of government approach, they're focused at looking at the earliest possible time that we can get Americans back to work safely and to give Americans the confidence they need to make sure that these are the right decisions.
That said, he was cautious, adding it was still too early to say for sure whether the target could be met. Meanwhile, President Trump reportedly mulled the option in March of allowing COVID-19 to wash over the U.S. as one potential strategy for dealing with the outbreak. According to the Washington Post, he suggested allowing the country to develop so-called herd immunity. Dr. Fauci, however, warned that many people would die. President Trump accepted Fauci's warning, but he's still highly focused on an early reopening of the country's economy. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Pro Baseball in Taiwan started its season on Sunday, making it the first of the big leagues to play ball this year since the pandemic brought sports to a halt around the world. The China Trust Brothers took on the Uni-President 7-11 Lions, going into extra innings for a 4-1 win for the Lions. Cable network 11 Sports streamed the game worldwide. Fans were not allowed to attend, but cardboard dummies and robotic mannequins filled the stadium in their place. Taiwan has only had a few hundred cases of the coronavirus and a total of 6 deaths, thanks to early detection and an effective response. That brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.